So I began my drawing with a piece of charcoal on its side to create a wash of tone on the paper, and I left a light bit in the middle which was going to be the light area of the sky which sits just above the horizon. And then I rubbed it all back with a rag just to lose the texture. And I was working on a 220 GSM cartridge paper, so thick enough to withstand the watery ink that I'm going to use. And I just used a black fountain pen ink, and I had really quite a diluted version of it though. And as I worked, I would start off with the diluted ink and then add in some of the neat ink. So I was never painting with the undiluted ink straight onto the paper. And you can see here that I put in the horizon line, and then I brought a line forward to create a bit of perspective. And I thought as soon as I started to put in these little vertical flicks that you can see here, suddenly it started to look like a landscape without me doing very much at all. And you can see now that I'm adding some of the neat ink and just letting it move along the wet areas so that it creates these lovely organic shapes which are really quite sympathetic for depicting a landscape. And I mostly worked with a number 10 brush, but I also had a finer number 4 brush, just so that I created some contrast in the scale of the marks as they sat on the paper. So then I left my drawing to dry completely, and when it was dry I started painting in a tree, and I used the very diluted ink, and I used the thicker brush but just with a very light touch, so it's not completely touching the paper all the time I'm working. And I wanted to try and avoid painting in branches which looked too heavy or too contrived too early on. And then I added in some of the darker ink, and you can see that it just travelled along the watery lines and started to kind of fill in the shapes I created. And rather nicely, as it moved away towards the outer edges of the tree, the tone of the ink became paler. So then I switched to my finer brush, and I just worked with what was on the paper and just pulled little lines away from the thicker lines that I'd used. And you could see at this point I was going to use a glass pen, but I wasn't getting the effect I wanted, so I went back to using the brush. And I just built up this little network of lines, so I didn't add any more ink at all. I just used what was on the paper already and pulled the lines out, and the ink just travelled along them. And as it got further and further away to the sort of outer edges of the branches, it became paler in tone, which worked really nicely. And then I wanted to have a shadow from the tree, so I just took some water on my brush and dragged it along the base of the tree, and you can see that all of the ink that was sort of being held in the trunk just spilled out into this watery area. And I blotted it a little bit with some tissue, so that's fine. If you've got too much ink moving around, you can just take a little bit off. But you can also see that you then get this lovely, again, you get this graduation of the tone as you move away from the source of the ink. You get these lovely pale washes of tone. And then I just carried on working, adding in some watery ink, dropping in a bit of neat ink, and tried to just let the ink move around a little bit and not to direct it too much, so that the drawing stayed kind of naturalistic and fluid. And I was trying to really showcase the lovely qualities of the ink, and built in some extra light tone and some pale tones as well. And there's a nice thing that happened, I think, coming up in a moment, where I just put some dark tone on the horizon line, and you can see it now just growing up into like a little tree on the horizon there, which wasn't anything to do with me. It was completely accidental, but really looked quite nice. And then at the very end, I just took a pencil eraser and just sort of made some streaks in my sky and lifted out a bit of the charcoal. And personally, I like the contrast between the two kinds of tone on the paper. The charcoal gives a different sort of texture to the fluidity of the ink.